I got asked while we were streaming, we're just like farming igneous cores so that we can go do Malphas, you know, just do another Uber grind. Super fun. But somebody asked me, how do I very quickly scan through the items that I'm looking at to be able to quickly salvage and sell? Now, Woody has made a great video about this. Always go watch Woody. He's just absolutely phenomenal. But I want to give people an idea of how I approach doing it, just in case this clicks for you. So I'm going to literally explain like step by step what I'm doing. And hopefully you can use that if it is useful to you, or pick up some tips you might not have thought about. One, I play on controller. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the gear. I'm going to choose whether or not to salvage it, or I'm going to choose to save it. And that's going to tell me later on how I'm going to put it into my stash if I need it. So that's like part of it. But I am going to go through it on controller like I normally would. So I've now sorted it. What does sorting do? Well, obviously you understand sorting, but for people who don't know, or for people who don't play on controller, you can just like click the button and do it. It sorts by item power, right? So this helmet is going to be the highest item power out of all the helmets that I have, with the one all the way to the right being the lowest. Same goes for chest pieces. This is going to be the highest item power chest piece that I have, all the way down to the lowest one. So on and so forth. Shields, offhands, two-handed weapons, one-handed weapons, and it doesn't matter which one. It's not like sides go before swords, as you can see here. And then it's going to go gloves, pants, boots, jewelry. So I already can do a pre-level of sorting or filtering in my head. Because there's one really important thing to understand, especially at this point in the game. You need to have an item power 925 weapon, theoretically, to have the strongest weapon possible. Now, yes, there's a combination of stats that you could put onto like a 920 or even a 915 that would rival a 925. But at the end of the day, the stats that you want require you to have the highest item power that you want. Now, that's similarly important for the resistances on rings and amulets. And while it is important for the armor roll, the actual armor value on a piece of gear that you have, you'll notice that like not every single piece of armor that I have is a 925, because it turns out they added Juggernaut to this game. So armor literally means nothing. And that's a good thing, because armor always sucked. But back to the original point, while I'm going to look at every single helmet that I dropped in, every single chest piece, and even every single offhand, starting with the two-handed weapons, if this isn't an item power 925, I don't need to look at it, which means that I can actually skip every single yellow weapon in the two-handed section and go straight to any legendary items, because I may want that aspect, because while some aspects need it to be the highest item power, most of them don't. Similarly, starting on the one-handed weapons, so it's item power 895. I don't need to read the stats on this weapon. I don't even know what type of weapon it is, because it's not a 925. I can completely ignore it. But I am going to look at the aspect. So I need to look at an aspect here, I need to look at an aspect here, and I need to look at an aspect here. Because even though this is only a 678 item power wand here, it's only 3 points off of a perfect grasping veins. So if I needed that, I would keep that. But going back to the actual armors, right? The things that I said I'm going to look at, kind of regardless of their item power. I'm going to start off by reading the first two stats on the piece of gear. Why? Because you can take a piece of gear that has 4 really good stats on it and re-roll the 4th one if you don't want it. Or you can find one with 2 really good stats and 1 okay stat, and then re-roll the 3rd stat. So you'll end up with either a 3 out of 4 affix item, a 3.5 out of 4 affix item, or a 4 out of 4 affix item. So just starting off right here, I'm looking at the initial item power. I know it's not 925, so if that's all I cared about, I could ignore it. I look at the first 2 stats. Resistance, willpower. These are not valuable on the Necromancer on a piece of gear. Now you may go, okay, Mac, well, how do I know what stats are valuable? That one you do just have to learn. But if I was looking at a piece of gear for the helmet, I'm either looking for total armor roll, maximum life, intelligence, all stats, ranks to decrepify, cooldown reduction, basic skill attack speed, and maximum essence. Those are the only stats that I care about. I do not care about a single other stat on a helmet. That's so that I can do builds that care about basic skill attack speed, like blood builds with hemorrhage, maximum essence for bone spear and bone spirit, although I have a Shaco, but like, you get what I'm saying there. Total armor, because making like a really high defensive piece of gear with total armor, maximum life, and ranks to decrepify is always really good. But I look at the first 2 stats of whatever the piece of gear is. Willpower, fire resistance, I don't care about those. And then I look at the aspect itself. This one, you could either read the aspect name, Blood Getters. So without looking at anything else, I know that this is going to give me 2 skeleton warriors, right? Or you can just look at the shape of the aspect. Aspects are very interesting in that they all have shapes to them because they are static images. They never change, right? While Blood Getters on an amulet would say 3 instead of 2, it will always say a bunch of orange text that includes skeletal, skeletal warrior, or skeletal mage is increased by 2. I don't need to read the entirety of the aspect. I don't even need to read the aspect name on top. I can just look at the shape of it. Now, that might sound a little bit crazy. Think about this as another really good example. +2 ranks to Decrepify, Necromancer only. If it says Necromancer only, that means that it's a skill. If it's a skill on a helmet, that means it's either Iron Maiden or Decrepify. So if I don't care about those things, I could see just the fact that it shows Necromancer only in that little box right there and ignore it completely outright. Learning the shapes of stats and the orientation of stats is going to be very important. A really good example is the fact that if you have all stats and intelligence, 2 stats that you want on every single weapon that you use on the Necromancer, it will always go all stats and then intelligence and then your additive damages. So you can think about the shape of them. All stats is very small, intelligence is longer. So without even reading what it is, I can already know what that affix is. You get the idea of like the shape of what I'm looking at. This is a tip that we do in speedrunning where we don't actually read what we're looking at. We look for shapes. If they're desirable shapes, then we hone in and read them. And that's why like compartmentalizing how much of it you look at is ultimately very helpful. So for this helmet, first 2 stats are bad. Look at the shape of the bottom. Don't care about that aspect. I'm going to salvage this. Great. It's gone. Next one. First 2 stats. Damage with blood orbs. I already hate it. Life on kill. Literally trash. Nothing good here. Look down. Consuming a corpse. So I know consuming a corpse is Embalmer. Obviously you can read this too, but like I stop reading after that point. I go straight to what the blue value is, what the number is, and it's a 30. Do I currently need a perfect Embalmers? No, I have more than enough perfect Embalmers, but any perfect aspect is typically good for you to keep, right? So here, even though the stats are trash, I'm going to keep this item. Now you might go, oh, well, of course you're going to mark this as a favorite, right? Here's the problem. Marking this as a favorite and then going and dumping it into my stash, I'm going to have a lot of things favorited if I use that form of management and moving it. No. Instead, what I do is if I'm going to keep a legendary aspect, in fact, I will not mark it at all. Why? Because I'll be able to search by the legendary aspect when I go into my stash. I don't need to highlight it for my eye to see it inside of the stash. I only need to highlight something if it has stats that I want, because that means that I can ignore whether or not it's a legendary item. I know it has good stats. So when I'm looking for like, hey, I want to replace my helmet with something. Let's go ahead and look at helmets in here. Oh, well, there's a whole bunch of them. This one is an aspect because I haven't, actually it's an Embalmer aspect, but this one's an aspect because it doesn't have stats that I care about. This one, regardless of what the aspect is, does have stats that I care about, right? So this one has a near perfect total armor, near perfect maximum life, a low roll on cooldown reduction, but that's not terrible, and then ranks to Decrepify, a really good stat there. So I will mark it if I want to keep it for the stats. If I don't want to keep it for the stats, instead I want to keep it for the aspect, I just drop it in there, because that means that any legendary item in my stash is there because it's an aspect, and I don't have to worry about what type of item it is or what kind of stats that it has. So that's how I'm able to differentiate it inside of the gear that I have here. Also, normally I don't actually label off unique items either. But okay, cool. Let's say I wanted to keep this aspect. Great, I'm not going to mark it. We can ignore it. We're not going to do anything with it. We're going to move on to the next item. Next item says Dex healing received, absolute trash. Again, this one already has the skeleton. This one's skeletal mages. Don't care about that. Don't need it. Moving on. This one, healing, regen. Don't care about those. Great. Healing, regen. Again, don't care about those. Look at the aspect very quickly. Oh, it's the one that says that you heal when there's monsters around you. Literally trash. Get rid of that. Okay, cool. Now we're on to armors. Armors are a little bit harder, just because it depends on what you're going for. Obviously, people tend to use armor for survivability stats, so total armor, maximum life, damage reduction, and damage reduction. But also, it turns out, especially if you're a Necromancer, you kind of only need Shielding Storm to be able to survive, and whether or not you need a total armor roll or some damage reduction roll on it. So very often I've been putting on more damage and more intelligence onto my builds. So here, we're again going to look at the top, and this will be based off of what stats you're currently looking for. I'm always looking for damage reduction stats, because what if I find a better piece of gear than what I currently have, right? So I will go, okay, first 2 stats, if they don't say armor, maximum life, or damage reduction, right? Those things which would be a little bit lower because damage stats tend to go on top and then survivability stats tend to go down below. The first 2 stats are damage types I don't care about in a combination. Darkness skill damage, and summoning skill damage. I've already done summon builds. I don't need to retest that. I can stop reading this immediately and go straight down to the aspect. The aspect starts off very quickly with a percentage. That means that's disobedience. And it's a low roll disobedience. And also I'm just generally not using disobedience anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this one. Okay, again, strength, already a dead stat. We don't care about that. Cold damage, first two stats, literally trash. I don't care about any of the other ones. I move on. Willpower, maximum minion life. Again, I don't care about these stats right now. For my personal build, willpower is always going to be trash on the Necromancer now that they've changed how overpower works in general. And again, what's the aspect? Skeletal, I don't need that. I'm moving on. Now we got a shield. Shields are a little bit more interesting, only because the item power is going to relate to the thorns in the armor, but it's not going to change how much damage it increases your main hand damage by. So you can actually get away with using a lower item power shield depending on what your build is. So again, we're going to look at the first two stats. Basic skill attack speed, actually not trash. I already like the one. Cool. What's the next one? Damage while picking up a blood orb. Interestingly enough, not necessarily a dead stat, only because anything that's using basic skill attack speed is going to be using hemorrhage. Hemorrhage is going to be a blood build. Blood builds don't hate blood orbs. Not valuable, but it's not dead. We may be able to work with this. Reading the third one. Lucky hit chance. Okay, lucky hit chance with barrier, not trash, not as important on Blood Lance, which is probably going to be using blood orbs the most. And then crowd control duration. Okay, I got to my fourth stat. There are two good stats here. I do not personally need a shield. I would want my shield to have lucky hit chance, cooldown reduction, and then either like resource reduction or like maximum life or something like that. I don't personally need this real quick. I'm going to go ahead and get down to the aspect. This is explosive mist. Why? Because it starts off by saying blood mist and then the value isn't perfect. I go straight down to the blue number. I don't need this. Moving on. Now we're into offhands. Offhands, we do care about item power, right? Because that's directly related to how much damage it adds onto us. We could use one that's in like the low 900s or like really high 800s. So this one's already kind of trash. It does have good stats though. It has critical strike chance within the first two stats. Then it has lucky hit chance, but it's a minimum roll. So at this point, I would stop reading the stats. Then we look down at the aspect. It says decompose at all. Kek W decompose. I don't personally need a rotting at this point if you are looking for that. But if it says decompose, you could probably just get rid of it. And then we go down the line, right? Again, this is a lower item power. I know that I don't want any offhand at a lower item power than this. I can literally ignore this item. Looking at my two-handers, not a 925, I can ignore all of these. I'm going to stop at this legendary aspect. This is a blighted. We like blighted. I don't care about the stats because it's not a 925 item power. And it's a min roll on blighted. Just going to go ahead and get rid of that. I don't personally need that. I can skip all these weapons. Here, Bone Storm, Kek W. Here, again, Grasping Veins. Oh, it's a 17. It's actually a high roll. I currently only have minimum rolls of 18 and 19 in my aspect slots, so I don't really need this right now, so I would move on. I'm always looking at gloves though. I don't care about the item power of a glove as long as it's over the 725 item power minimum, so I can get the maximum rolls on stats here. So first two stats, willpower crit. Now I can't stop reading at this point. Why? Because crit's a good stat that we want, and it's also a maximum roll on crit. I now read the third one, overpower. Okay, it's not going to be terrible. You could go with like an attack speed, crit, overpower, blood lance here. But because it doesn't say Necromancer only at the bottom, I know this doesn't have any stats on it, or rather it doesn't have any ranks to skills. So I could personally ignore this because I know that I already have better gloves and I don't need to roll a 3 out of 4 glove here. I'm looking for 4 out of 4 gloves. But for you personally, willpower is not a dead stat on an overpower build. So if this did have ranks to Blood Lance or Blood Surge, and that was better than whatever you had, this does effectively say overpower damage, crit chance, overpower damage, and then ranks to the skill. So again, not terrible gloves, something that you could use in the interim. Not good by any means, but not terrible. Here, intelligence, pretty decent stat. Sadly, the gloves are like so chock-a-block full of really important stats that I find it hard to put intelligence onto my gloves unless I'm using them for an Infinimus build that doesn't need ranks to a skill here. But intelligence, not a dead stat. Critical strike chance, not great, if I'm going to be honest with you. Lucky hit, I go ahead and I check anything that says lucky hit because it might say lucky hit chance to be able to restore essence. And that's obviously really important on a ton of builds, right? And then again, down at the bottom, we see a shape that says Necromancer only. I know that I have skill ranks. It's worth it to keep reading this piece of gear. It says Bone Spear. Okay, cool. So let's go back up a little bit, right? So Bone Spear, good. Intelligence, not terrible. Crit chance, sadly, not the crit chance that we're looking for, and then a bad lucky hit roll. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these gloves, but again, literally not useless because you could just put on attack speed over this lucky hit chance. And then it does say damage, Bone Spear, bad crit chance, and then attack speed. And those aren't useless gloves, especially like much earlier on in the game. This gloves, already kind of some interesting stuff. I see two shapes that I like. I see Necromancer only, and I see Lucky Hit. So while I would normally stop after reading the first two, I know that there's something good down at the bottom. Crit chance again against injured, trash, shadow damage over time. Not the worst stat depending on what we want on these gloves. Lucky Hit chance to be able to restore primary essence. Okay, dope. And then Blood Surge. Cool. Two good stats. Crit chance against an injured enemy isn't as bad on Blood Surge, only because, especially in the early game, Blood Surge tends to take longer to be able to kill a single target. So you will fight a person through the injured stats for an okay amount of time as long as they're a boss. So these could say Blood Surge, attack speed, chance to restore essence, as well as crit chance. So again, not good gloves for me, but not terrible. But that gives me pause seeing those two shapes down at the bottom. Here, I know I'm going to need to check the aspect, but all stats, willpower, trash. There's no way for me to use these gloves here. Bloodlance, Bloodseekers, trash. You can just throw this away. It's a terrible aspect. Again, overpower. All right, already not terrible. Lucky hit chance. Lucky hit chance and overpower. This could be pretty decent. Ranks to sever. I see that shape of Necromancer only. And then down at the bottom, Blood Surge. Okay, Blood Surge, overpower, lucky hit chance. I could throw on attack speed here if I was looking to proc something from another piece of gear. Not terrible gloves, obviously not good gloves. They have a low rank roll of 2. So I'm going to toss these. Let's just check the aspect. Bone Prison. I don't need plunging darkness here, which is what this is because it says Bone Prison and then Blight with a value, so I can ignore reading the rest of that. I don't really care about that. Here for pants. Pants are obviously, I've got a lot of interesting stats on them. We're going to be able to get the Necromancer only shape, so we can get those additional skill ranks to things like Corpse Explosion, which is really nice, even Blood Mist, which can be cool in some certain scenarios. But again, we're typically looking for 4 survivability stats or 3 with a skill rank on pants for the Necromancer, because it's very easy to kind of just push all your survivability into your pants so you can fit damage on other pieces of gear. So I'm looking for maximum life, total armor, damage reduction, damage reduction. I could even run like a 3 damage reduction with 1 maximum life roll, again, if I'm using Juggernaut. So I'm going to start with strength, intelligence. Okay, intelligence, not a terrible stat if I'm looking to get damage onto my pants. We could re-roll the strength. I'm going to read a little bit further. Boom, we hit cold resistance. You should never use resistances on your pants or on your helmet. You should literally only ever put them onto your boots. It's the only place where you don't lose out on a significantly better stat. And then while the ranks to Corpse Explosion is kind of interesting, theoretically, I could make this intelligence ranks to Corpse Explosion and then all stats and get some additional percentage damage out of my pants. Not going to be worth it for us. Again, we got down consuming a corpse. I already know that that's going to be Embalmer. It says 22. I already passed on to 30 earlier. So even in reference to the other aspects that I've seen already, that can help me to more quickly filter the pieces of gear that I'm looking at. I literally only use boots with maximum evade charges. So if it doesn't say maximum evade charges, I keep moving. I will check out the aspect at the end, but here we do have maximum evade charges. Sadly, it is a very low item power piece of gear, so I know I can't get max rolls on it. But if we were to use it as an example, I read strength, shrine buff duration, I can stop reading. There's no way that I can get at least 1 resistance, essence cost reduction, movement speed, and then a good stat on this piece of gear. And I'm just going to very quickly check out Torturous. Laugh because it says Torturous. Also, it's a max roll of Torturous when you actually want a min roll on Torturous if you are going to use it, which you shouldn't, but if you are. So this basically checks none of the boxes other than max evade charges. I could have moved on at the moment that I read those first 2 stats right there. For rings. People are going to be like item power Andes when it comes to like jewelry. You can fix your resistances on the Necromancer very easily without having to have maximum item power rings. So I do not discriminate by item power here. And I also don't care about what resistances are on the ring itself. You can't do anything about it, and you're not going to pass up a really good ring just because it doesn't have fire res on it. You're just going to put a diamond into your gear as opposed to a skull. Here, you basically have to read all 4 stats because many different builds require incredibly different stats on their rings to be good. A lot of the time we're looking for crit chance, lucky hit chance, and then maximum life, maximum essence, resource generation, or just maximum rolls on good damage. So damage to close, damage to distant, crit damage, vulnerable damage, crit with bone, overpower, darkness or shadow. I forget which one is on rings. So I'm going to read all 4 because there might be 3 decent enough stats on this, even if you don't necessarily care about all of the damage types, to be able to fit in whatever like really important stat, crit, lucky hit chance that you actually need. So physical damage, good on just about everything other than darkness builds. Damage to distant enemies, really only good for Blood Surge and Bone Spear. Damage to stun enemies, I just don't use damage to crowd controlled whenever I can avoid it, just because it doesn't work on bosses or work until something is crowd controlled, and not every single build has like permanent uptime on corpse tendrils. And then the last stat, life regen. So 2 stats that are kind of okay for additive damage rolls. They're not perfect. The other 2 are kind of trash. I would just move on from this ring. Gonna just read the aspect. Bone Spirits, whatever. There's a space in between the first part and the second part. That means that this is Swelling Curse. It's going to talk about the first part where it's going to give you crit chance and the second part where it's going to increase your maximum essence. I only need to read that blue number. It says 16. It's basically a min roll. I would move on from this. Again, starting off with the first 2 stats just to get a very quick idea. Vulnerable, decent. It's a low roll, but whatever. Cold damage, absolutely trash. The third one, life regen, trash. There's nothing that could salvage this ring. Moving on. Here. Crit damage, damage with bone, so it's already crit with bone, and then damage after a blood orb, probably going to be pretty trash. And then has minions inherit, that's nothing, unless you're a minion build and you like using it, that's perfectly fine. But it does have a high max essence roll, so this ring could say crit damage, maximum essence, crit chance, with damage after picking up a blood orb, which doesn't really matter. But again, it's okay to have a 3 out of 4 ring. I do not need this because at this point, the rings that I'm dealing with are just like either like perfect or near perfect. So I do not personally need this, but this would be a fine 3-point ring if you really needed it. Then looking down, whenever your blood skills, that means that we're talking about Rathma's Chosen. I need to look at the blue number, 20. 20 is the min roll for Rathma's Chosen. I have plenty of 50s. I would move on from this as well. And then for amulets, again, amulets are even more convoluted than a ring, because basically as long as it says Necromancer only or 3 really good stats, you can get to an amulet that may work for your build. So we're going to start with blood skill damage. Additive damage on the amulet is very low value, but not completely dead. Lucky at chance while barrier. I'm not going to care about lucky at chance with barrier and blood skills. I can kind of move on at this point, but shrine buff duration, absolutely trash. Crowd control, impairment, duration reduction. Almost as bad as damage reduction from shadow damage over time affected enemies, but not quite. Also trash, right? So the first 2 stats don't really synergize. It doesn't say Necromancer only, so that means that we don't have any ranks to skills, which you need on an amulet. So I'd move on to the aspect. Blood Surge is Nova. Don't care about that, not running Blood Surge anymore, but you would want a minimum roll on this, and it is 1% off minimum. So that's not terrible, right? You would toss this in if you wanted it. I personally always salvage everything because you make just gobs of gold if you actually just turn in your Tree of Whispers, you know, like 10 million plus gold, and selling an entire inventory here I think would get us like 1 million gold even with all of the legendaries. So I always salvage so that I can get as many Forgotten Souls and Veiled Crystals back as possible. And then if I actually had space in my inventory, I wouldn't even have to look, right? I know that I want to save this item just because it's a legendary aspect that I may be looking for. I don't need to care about its stats. If I had anything flagged, I know I would also want to save that because it has stats that I want. So I don't need to look at it. I would immediately transfer it over, but I'm completely full here.